we're finishing up two things actually. We're finishing up this whole series on knowing God's direction, and we're finishing up. Last week we started talking about God's will, our will, kind of thing, and it was a really good meeting, I thought. But it was also, there was a lot that happened in the meeting, so I broke it off at what I felt was an appropriate point. So we're going to kind of pick it up kind of from there. Now, Mark, you weren't here, but just to kind of give you 2 to 3 minute kind of review. This whole thing about God's will, you know, theologians have said they refer to God's perfect will and his permissive will, almost giving the indication that he has two wills. And basically, my take on it, as another, whatever you want to call me, teacher, we desperately so need to try to understand, you know, the way God does things. We're pretty clued up on our own wills, so we kind of superimpose that back on God. And actually, in Genesis, when you look at creation, there's no indication of any kind of a will present. What there is a God, and from within him, his own character is good. So therefore, when he speaks, it's good. And creation comes from that, and it's good. To try to say he was exercising his will really doesn't even make good theological sense. Why? Exercise his will, what does that even mean? So we were kind of looking at it last week of, we are going to continue to talk about God's will because it works. And I think that's one of the reasons throughout the Bible it talks about God's will occasionally here and there, is because it works to help us to understand God's intent, God's desire, God's delight, things like that. But it gets very, very confusing when we try to compare our wills, because then we think that God wills things like the way we do. And he doesn't. That's a silly kind of comparison, making God into almost like a man that way. So we talked a bit about that last week, and looked at some scriptures in Genesis and Isaiah and stuff like that, all pertaining to this development of the will. And I get, just, you know, to put you in the picture, it's not until Genesis 2 where God says it's not good for man to be alone. Everything that poured out from him, everything he spoke, and all of creation was good. And then it's not good that man should be alone, and he creates a helper for him. And in the context of that, again, this is my take on it, that basically what was happening was man, he wasn't even called Adam at that point. Man's will was starting to develop, so to speak, apart from God's. In other words, man is looking at the animals and saying, you know, there's no mate for me and this kind of thing. In other words, his affections were dropping from the Father and from heaven and creation and goodness down to the animal kingdom, stuff like that. So that's not good. So he creates a helper to help him keep his eyes on God, basically, more than anything else, to keep his will. And so then we did a little illustration, I think I told you we were going to do, about harmony, and use the keyboard to produce different tones, some that were not so pleasing, showing the difference between us and God when our will is really at odds with each other. More pleasing harmonies, fifths, you know, that kind of thing, where it sounds nice, there's no tension there, there's no friction, but it's still two very discernible tones. And then I played an octave, where, in fact, on Sunday morning when I asked how many notes am I playing, somebody said 1. Because if you don't know somebody's playing 2 notes, because it's an octave, it could sound just like one tone, especially to somebody who's not a musician. And they were shocked when I said I was actually playing 2 different notes. She said, that's impossible, it's the same note. No, they're 2 different notes, but the harmony, it's unison, and the harmony is so pure and so tight. That's where Jesus walked. When Jesus says, I and my Father are one, there's we are just in that octave, we're just in that place. I'm still here, he's still my Father, but we're one. We're in such perfect unison. So we were in that place talking last week, and then we got just right down into Jesus himself and looking at some things. And just to put us all back in the picture from last week, we looked at Joseph. He was not willing to have Mary stoned. He just wanted to put her away quietly. Jesus says, as a grown man, basically to do to others what you would have them do to you, kind of thing. So when you're exercising your will and making decisions about others, I almost see him getting so many things from his mother and father, Jesus. And that thing, I could see Joseph, him looking at his dad and saying he did to Mary the way he would have liked to have probably been treated, with a little bit of mercy and some grace. That's what he did when he exercised his will. So the first point that Jesus makes, that his dad made, when every decision we make, it may not immediately, but it impacts others. And everything we're doing here, even the things that we may do that we consider in private, so to speak, has an impact on others. Always has an impact. That our wills involve and impact others. That's the way God designed us. That's the way God is. God's very interaction with mankind as a father is one of others. It has to do with otherness, not always just showing you, I'm God and you're not, this is the way I do things, deal with it. It's never like that. It's always, I realize every word in the Bible, everything I've done, every cell and molecule I've created in all of creation, all interacts, depends on each other. This is an other thing all the time. Your will is intrinsically involved with that. It always becomes kind of a funny thing to me when people are trying to make decisions and not thinking about anybody else at all. Because to me, that is about as far outside the box as it gets. How can you even begin to think? How can you think in terms of doing things and not be thinking about anybody else but yourself? It's kind of, to be honest with you, that's what Lucifer did. That's kind of like a satanic way of dealing with life. It's all about me. It's my will, what I want, That is not God at all. We but we said at his water baptism, when it says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Throughout the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, the word will is a word that is different than the way we look at it. It really means desire and delight. Those are the two words that stick out more than anything else. So when the Father is saying about the Son, in whom I'm well pleased, he's really saying very clearly, we use the word will, he takes it on board so we can understand where he's coming from. He's saying, this is my desire and my delight. So we say, so this is your will. And you say, okay, well, I know you guys like that word. So yeah, this is my will. Okay, it's my will. This is my Son. This is my desire. This is my delight. Very, very important to keep in mind about God's will, so to speak, that if it's an expression of anything, it's his character and his delight, his pleasure, his desire just being poured out, what he delights in. We started to get into the prayers a bit last week with the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus says, your kingdom come, your will be done, indicating that sometimes it's not. And I know that there's people that would say, well, you pray for the kingdom to come and his will be done. That's just bad teaching. That's just not true. I don't even know where you get that from. Jesus distinctly gave us both of them in praying for the rule and the reign of Christ, the kingdom on earth. All of this, by the way, I'm trying to plug it into knowing God's direction. So looking at the wills, our wills and God's, we should be learning that God's will, which we're trying to come into unison and harmony with, impacts and involves others. God's will, when we're looking for the Lord's direction, if we're making a decision, if we're going to do something that is going to really disrupt what we know God is pleased with, it's going to really disrupt the harmony that we share among people. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that we do things that really bug people in the workplace or whatever, and that's still God's will going forward. So I'm not talking in terms of like everything's going to always work out. I don't mean it quite that way. But we should be looking, when we're making the decision, God, are you delighted with this? In Psalm 40, which we're going to read in a minute, it says, I come to do your will. I delight to do your will, which is about as beautiful a way of saying, I delight in your delight, because I know you delight in my delight, and I delight in your delight, and isn't this delightful? It's kind of, and that's what I really, that's kind of like where Jesus is walking all the time. He's just not having a bad day. It's just like,
wow.
This is just, it's good. Our problem is we don't understand the complexity of good. And we don't see how that could be good. I just don't see it. Okay, well, you're also not God, are you? And Paul even says things like, okay, but these things will work together for good. No, it's not good. Some of the things that happened to our most recent guest who's here with us. Some very nasty things. But she knows, we know, and will pray into God using all of those things for good. When we walk in the love of God and remain true to being called to His purposes, not ours. Not our will be done, but His will be done. Gave an example last week about Joshua outside of Jericho the night before the battle. When Jesus shows up there, the angel of the Lord, however you want to see that imagery. And Joshua immediately asks him, so are you for us or for our adversaries? And the answer is no. And it's apparently not an answer to the question, because wrong question. Maybe the question would be, are you pleased? Is this your delight to see a few 100,000 men about to chop each other's heads off and slice our throats and bleed and leave our wives without husbands? Happy, 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 happy time. Is that... I know there's a question. That could be a good question to say, no, I'm not happy about that. That is not my delight. That is not my pleasure. It is not my desire. It is not good. But Joshua's, our human mentality is, are you for me or against me? Are you for me and against me? This kind of thing. And then he makes this profound statement that I'm the captain of the host, which is a nice way of saying, you guys have your way of dealing with your affairs on earth. And you've got your armies, and you've kitted them out pretty good. And they're very good at what they do, killing other people, for a variety of different reasons. I am the captain of the host. I'm the captain of all the angels. And our remit is not to destroy, but to create. That's what we do. We're in a whole different dimension. Jesus in the garden, when he tells them, there's not going to be a fight here tonight. Don't you realize, he's speaking again like to Joshua, don't you realize I could call down 12 legions of angels? Do you realize I'm the captain of the host? Do you realize that I can just bring one? Did you read the Old Testament about one angel killing 183,000 people? Ever read that? In one night? I mean, are you serious about this battle in the garden? We're okay, boys. Relax. This is the battle that could, hasn't, but could end all battles if people would receive the victory and the love of Christ. But this is what's happening with Joshua. It's very similar to what happens with Elisha when he prays that his servant would be able to see the reality of the situation. They're surrounded by this huge army. He's really, really scared. Elisha prays, Lord, open his eyes so he could see the reality. And that's when he sees the chariots of fire and the horses and all the angels just kind of hanging around over the whole thing. He's like, wow, never saw that. And Elisha says, yeah, but that's reality right there. That's reality.